Okay, welcome back to Elements of Worship. Today we're going to start talking about song, and then we're going to talk about it next week as well. So we're going to talk about singing in the worship service. And I wanted to start just by asking, what is singing, or what have other people compared it to? And I thought, and that's probably a lot of different answers to that, but 4 categories came to mind, which are other separate categories which singing has been compared to. The first one is prayer. You find this in the preface, John Calvin's preface to the Psalter. He says singing is basically prayer set to music. And that's not wrong. Certainly a lot of the Psalms, as we look at them, are prayers. But actually, another category we find in the Bible itself, where the equation being explicitly made, and we'll see this later, is teaching. That when we're singing, we're doing teaching set to music. And yet another, probably not unrelated category that's also in the Bible is prophecy. That when we are singing, it's prophecy set to music. And then the fourth one that came to mind was confession of faith. That we are confessing our faiths. We're publicly speaking words that we know and believe to be true. That has always raised this question for me. Why do we sing? All of these are things that we could do without singing. And we do them in our worship service at various points without singing. So why is it that we have music? And I don't think there's a straight, theoretical answer about why music, in any, Paul didn't write a whole chapter and epistle about why we would use music. But I started my studying this week by looking for clues in the Bible about what the purpose and role of singing particularly is. Why has God called us not only to speak words, but also to sing them? So the first purpose for singing that showed up to me is preserving memory. And I'm pulling this out of Deuteronomy 31, first of all. This is the song that Moses teaches the people of Israel. And he says, and God tells Moses, and now write for yourselves this song and teach it to the children of Israel. Place it in their mouths that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. This song will testify against them, for it will not be forgotten from the mouth of their seed. So there's this idea that putting it in song will preserve it in memory. Many peoples at the time that this was written had epic poetry traditions that they used to preserve important material. And you could look at music as inherently kin to poetry. The lyrics that go with a song are often in poetry. And it's interesting, write for yourselves. That's not singular. That's not God saying to Moses, write this down. Although I assume Moses was the first one to write it down. Rather, that's a plural verb. So it's focusing the fact that generation after generation is going to have to keep copying and passing down this song. And it's going to kind of stick in their memories. We find a similar idea in Psalm 42. So in Psalm 40, I picked 2 parts of this psalm. There's an earlier part where he's going to the temple and he says, I shall remember these things and pour out my soul within me. How I would go along into the sanctuary. I would move towards the house of God with a voice of rejoicing and thanksgiving while the multitude was celebrating the feast. This is early on in this, and it's a lament. The psalmist has hit a hard time, and he's remembering when he would go into the sanctuary with the multitudes and with the voice of rejoicing. And I find it very interesting that when we get to verse 8, we find this. By day the Lord commands his mercy, and by night his song is with me, a prayer to the living God. And my interpretation of this would be that the prayers of rejoicing and thanksgiving that the psalmist has heard when he has come to the temple in Jerusalem with God's people have stuck with him. They've stuck in his head. And now at night, now that he's isolated, cut off, alone, and kind of in mourning and misery in the middle of the night, God's songs that come back to him, and he remembers them, and they help him pray to God. So it seems to be one of the reasons we use music, is that it helps us remember things, and so it helps those words that God gives us become deeply ingrained in our memories. Another thing that seems to show up occasionally is the way in which music kind of represents the unity of a group of people. So for instance, in Second Chronicles, and as one, the trumpeters and singers would sound out one sound, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. And as they lifted up a sound with trumpets, cymbals, and musical instruments, and while praising the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy is forever, the house of the Lord was filled with smoke. The Chronicle emphasizes the glory of the Lord coming to fill the house as the people sing together. And one of the things that's really emphasized in this passage, of course, the unity of the people of God is a big theme for the chronicler in general. But if you think about music, you think about the words and how we try to say them at the same time, and the fact that there's a rhythm and we try to stay on the beat. Sometimes that's more of a struggle than others. But there's this, music has this kind of symbolic representation of our unity together as we try to stay together in what we're saying. We're saying things together, we're saying them, and that rhythm that comes with music helps us do that, helps us speak these words at the same time. And there's a picture there of the unity of the whole church. It's music is something that kind of embodies that unity together. Another purpose for singing is that it engages our whole being. So here's Psalm 108:2. My heart is set, God, I will sing and make melody even with my substance. And I have /liver. Let me explain that. This is either the Hebrew word for glory, but probably used in the sense of, it may sometimes have of substance, as in like my whole being or existence. But it's possible that it should be repointed as the Hebrew word for liver. Well, you think, well, that's weird, but the liver was understood as one of the seats of emotion. So if you're, just to remind you of how they metaphorically understand the body in Hebrew, which is different than English, the heart is kind of the center of thinking and willing. We think of the heart as a seat of emotions and the brain as the center of thinking and willing, but they thought of the heart as the center of thinking and willing. The heart is really more like the brain in some ways. And your guts in your lower abdomen, those are like more the seat of passion and emotion. And so either way, whichever interpretation is right, it's clear that singing is important partially because it's embodied. It includes both our minds, but also our bodies. As you know, we kind of reach from our diaphragms out, and therefore involves our whole selves in praise towards God in a way that perhaps merely speaking would not. And then finally, engaging the emotions. And we could probably give a lot of different examples for this, but I picked a couple. First Chronicles. And David said to the leaders of the Levites to appoint their brothers as singers with musical instruments, harps, lyres, cymbals, sounding out to lift up a sound for joy. I could have picked actually many, many verses that correlate joy with music and musical instruments, especially. It's clear that there's something very appropriate about that there's certain rhythms evoke certain emotions and kind of help us engage those emotions. Now, while there's a lot of examples with joy, that's not the only emotion that we find. So for instance, Ezekiel 19:1, and you lift up a lament for the princes of Israel. And the word for lament in Hebrew is kinah, and it actually seems to be a technical term. There's a very particular meter of alternating couplets of 3 words and 2 words, which seems to be used, say, in the book of Lamentations or here in Ezekiel 19. And it was a specific lament rhythm that would help engage sad emotions and help express and give expression, embodiment to sad emotions. We could probably list other emotions as well, but this is just a start. That music is not just there to help us feel joy, but can also help us express mourning. And we could also talk as well about all of those enigmatic headings in the book of Psalms, the different tunes or meters or whatever they were. I mean, they didn't have sheet music at the time, so they would have been traditional music forms that are mentioned in the headings to the Psalms. We don't know nearly as much as we'd like. We know almost nothing about what they actually were, but just based on their sort of names, like the doe or whatever, they evoke certain ideas and emotions that complement the words that are being said. And finally, I think one verse that kind of brings it all together in Colossians 3:16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and instructing each other with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, with thankfulness, singing in your hearts to God. We'll come back to this verse later and dissect it in more detail. But for now, I just want to pull out the word of Christ dwelling in you richly, that there's something about singing that makes the word of Christ dwell in us in a rich way. I think this connects to the sort of full embodied sense that our minds and our emotions and our bodies are being aligned through singing. And then, of course, we have teaching here. Like I said, one of the big categories for understanding that what music does, that it helps us remember. It teaches and helps us remember certain ideas. Okay, so today and tomorrow, we're going to go over just a history of singing in the Bible, and let that lead us into some reflections about how we should think about singing in the service. So let's start at the beginning. The patriarchs don't sing. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, no singing. Their worship of God just doesn't involve song at all. I mean, I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but it seems kind of striking. I think that there's one person who sings in the Bible, really, before we get to like Moses in the Exodus, and and it's not good. It's Lamech. Lamech has this poem where he perhaps it's like some contemporary music. He has multiple women. He calls up his multiple wives to back him up, and then he gives this terrible poem about how if you dishonor him, he's going to strike you down and murder you, even if you're a child. Why do I think that's music? Well, Lamech's children are credited with inventing various musical instruments. So I think it makes sense to see that as a song. So that's a bad start for song in the Bible, that it's actually being used to glorify human violence and sexuality, basically. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And yet, like so many other things in that, so many of the other inventions in that section in Genesis 4 that are put to bad use, God still has intentions for those cultural things to be redeemed. But it gets off to a bad start. Well, when do God's people start singing? That starts with Moses and the Exodus. So the Song of the Sea, when Israel is delivered from the Red Sea in Exodus 15, Moses and Miriam sing this song. And it's the first song that they've sung. And then there's a number of other songs from the same period. So the well song, this song that they sing as they're digging the well for the water God has provided for them. And it seems they sang that multiple times. And then there's the Song of Moses. The book of Deuteronomy ends with this song. Deuteronomy 31 covers kind of instructions for it, and 32 is the song itself that's going to stand as a witness or a testimony to Israel. So there's not that much song in the Pentateuch, but it ends with a song that points us it kind of caps off the whole thing with a song summing everything up that the people are to remember. I also included Moses' psalm in here. We don't find it in our Bibles until we get to Psalm 90. A collection I'll mention later, I would argue was put together at the time of the exile, like the actual editing of the book at that point. But it says the psalm was written by Moses. So somebody must have been keeping a hold of that. Perhaps there was other music that just didn't quite make it into our book of Psalms, or maybe it did just without being labeled. Another song we find early on are Deborah and Barak's song when they're delivered at Judges 5, about God bringing defeat to Sisera and saving his people. We also find this thing called the Book of Jashar, or I guess in Hebrew, it would be the Book of Yashar. I mentioned it. It's only mentioned a couple times. So one is the sun stands still in Joshua 10. There's a couple just lines of poetry included in Joshua 10, and it said that they come from the Book of Yashar, about the sun standing still. And then when David writes his lament for Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel, he says to add it to the book of Yashar. So I think we can assume that there was more than just like the Joshua sun stand still poem. And perhaps that was part of a longer poem, which would make sense. But I think, we don't really know necessarily what was in it. Perhaps some of it did make it into our Psalter just without being labeled. Just a second here. I see we have something in the chat. Yeah, I mean, can we make a distinction between first singing and first recorded instance? Yeah, I mean, we can make a distinction. Perhaps people are singing and we're just not aware of it. I would just say there's just, there's no evidence of it. So
I would say though that it's a cultural, I mean, it's part of being, I think it's part of being human.
Oh, absolutely. People.
And so I think the expectation is that people probably were singing, but I'm happy to accept that, we don't have any recorded of sort of the gathered people of God singing before these instances that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. And I'm sure that's kind of part of the point behind Genesis 4 is like, cities come into existence, instruments come into existence. Like it's part of the cultural fabric of what people are doing. So one thing to notice about song at this point is that clearly God's people are singing during great deliverances, and clearly songs are being written down and remembered. But the actual rituals of the tabernacle don't involve any song whatsoever. As Moses receives them from God, they merely involve doing the various offerings pretty much in complete silence. But that changes with David. David is the one who actually introduces song into the service of the temple. We find some good summaries of this. Of course, Book of Chronicles in some ways all about this. The chronicler, I think, is very interested in the Psalms generally and in Israel's worship tradition. And one of the things he adds a lot to Kings and Samuel and Kings is information about worship. But at a couple of times that we have these reforms, we have references back to David. Jehoiada allowed the assignments of the house of the Lord in the hand, so that should be allotted the assignments of the house of the Lord in the hand of the priests and the Levites, whom David arranged over the house of the Lord, to offer the burnt offerings of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with joy and with song on the authority of David. So you have this interesting double parallel here. Like we're restoring the temple sacrifices as Moses commanded, but also we understand, and the chronicler really sets David up as a prophet, that like God gives him new revelation about how worship is going to go. And it involves both reorganizing the priests and the Levites for their service in the temple as they create the temple. And then it also involves song being introduced into the worship of the temple. And really, like, it seems like continually, the ideal was that there's always somebody singing somewhere in the temple. Again, another look at this during Hezekiah's time. And Hezekiah commanded the burnt offerings to be offered on the altar. And at the time the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord and the trumpets began, on the authority of the instruments of David, king of Israel. And all the assembly were bowing down, and the singers were singing, and the trumpeters were playing, all of them, until the end of the burnt offering. That on the authority of the instruments of David, you could quibble with that translation, but I do think the idea is that what David does is the model for what Hezekiah does. And here you can see very clearly that there's a special association of song with the sacrifices, that now as the sacrifices are being done, they're going to be accompanied by praises to God with songs and instruments. And notice the inclusion of the whole assembly here. You do have these special singers who David appoints, but the whole congregation joins with David. And we can go back in Chronicles to the point where David actually appoints them. Looks like I have a couple of stuff in this slide twice, so we'll just look at the first one here. David and the captains of the army set apart for service the sons of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, who prophesied with harps and lyres and cymbals. So We have three, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun are Levites. They're set apart, especially to be in charge of the music. And we have Psalms composed by Asaph, or perhaps his descendants in some cases. And then we also have Ethan, who seems to be the same as Jeduthun, not so much from him. But clearly this is an ongoing role by their by their sons who organize the worship. Notice here, this is one of those really important places where it's said that they're prophesying, which is really interesting. That when they're singing, or is singing or writing music? Is it singing or writing music? Or both, or really both together? I would say probably singing, which presupposes writing, is thought of as prophecy. And I would mention, in case you have noticed it before, that there is at least one other example where when of prophecy being actually accompanied by music, when Samuel tells Saul that he's going to meet these prophets coming down and he's going to prophesy too. There specifically says the prophets are coming out and they're playing music while they're prophesying. A large chunk of the prophecy in the Bible is actually poetry. And so we also have this association between prophecy and music, that something about music is conducive to prophecy. And I mean, one cultural thing I'd mention, in our culture, we kind of put serious documents in prose, and maybe we think about poetry or music as like entertainment or something like that. That's not how ancient cultures tended to view poetry. Poetry was the most important, like the highest form of things, and therefore you might very well put law or legal documents or deeply important literature set it in poetry because it was so high and important. So anyway, notice the connection between prophecy and music here. So David also gives us the Psalter, or at least the starts of it. He writes a bunch of Psalms. And without doing a whole class on the Psalter, I know Dory has already done one. I just wanted to mention the types of Psalms. Every scholar has a different list. This is my categorization. But you have Psalms of praise, which are fundamentally call us to praise God and then give us a reason why we should pray, something from who he is or what he's done. We have laments as well. The lament is a situation either whether you're in trouble and you're asking God to help, or where you're mourning and asking God to redress something grievous that's happened. By the way, of these subdivisions, laments are the most common genre in the Psalms. More laments than Psalms of praise. And, one wonders sometimes whether our own worship could reflect lament more. I know Michael Card, I'm kind of a fan of Michael Card, Christian musical artist, and he's tried to address that a lot by actually focusing a lot of his musical attention on laments and biblical laments. But lament, an important category, biblical patterns that express our need for God's help, our potential fear at our circumstances, and our grief and mourning at tragedy. Thanksgiving Psalms. These kind of correlate with laments. These are when God delivers you from your situation, you sing a Thanksgiving Psalm to God. So that's a very distinct genre. Teaching or wisdom Psalms I would include as well, especially given the focus elsewhere in the Bible that music is about teaching. We have certain Psalms that don't really fit in the Thanksgiving Psalm category, although I think they often follow a Thanksgiving Psalm. I think there's a pattern some places in the Psalter where once the psalmist is delivered from their trial and they sing a Thanksgiving Psalm, that they go on to like a kind of lessons learned sort of psalm, which is a teaching or wisdom psalm. And these really just focus on instruction about truth about who God is and what reality is like. And then royal psalms, there are some psalms that are particularly about the king, or perhaps about God as king, that seem to fit cluster together. And then there's a particular set of pilgrimage psalms as well about going up to the house of the Lord that seem to like kind of cluster in genre divisions. So this is kind of an idea of what Israel's worship in the Psalms look like. And then just a brief overview of like, where did the book of Psalms come from? So books 1 to 2 seem to fit. And this is, by the way, this is not a comment about where individual Psalms come from. Many of them throughout the whole book are ascribed to David. Psalm 90, which I'm calling post-exilic here, is ascribed to Moses. This is about where the collection comes from. When did these get edited into a book? And it does seem Psalms 3 through 72 we would associate with David and the monarchy. And they break down into 2 distinct collections. Notice that they number exactly 70. So that's a pretty good candidate for an initial nucleus for the book right there. But then the Psalms in book 3 really culminate in the exile and the destruction of the temple. And I would date those, I would plausibly, it's hard to prove any of these, but I plausibly put these around the time when Israel is removed from the land. And there's a lot of lament that deals with the situation of God's king being removed, his temple being destroyed, especially Psalm 88 and 89. And then book 4, Psalms 90 through 106, I think seem to date a little bit later, but I would put still in the time of the exile, post-exilic. And they grapple with what it means to not have a human king. A lot of these Psalms emphasize that God is king, because that seems to be one of the theological ways that people responded to lacking a human king, was sitting back and saying, well, wait a second, God is still king. That was a very important theological point in books that date from the exile in the Bible. And then book 5, and I also think the introduction, Psalms 1 to 2, can't prove that for sure, but it seems like they're not ascribed to David. Psalms 1 and 2 are not ascribed to David. And they seem like a good introduction to the whole Psalter. But Psalms 107, 150, you find them quoted a lot in Chronicles. And so I think that they kind of form the favorite hymn book of those who return from exile. And so I kind of put them there. But the big point I want to draw out of this, other than just, some background to help you understand where the Psalm collections come from, is that as God's people experience new acts of God in redemptive history, the Psalter grows. New Psalms are added, and that respond either in lament or praise to what God is doing.
Jamie, could I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Are you saying that all or many of these Psalms could have been out there? Some obviously not, because they came later, but the booking of them, this was the period in which these songs that were out there were grouped in these books. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Yes. So Psalm 90 is from Moses. So that must actually be very old, and I mean, Kings tells us that Solomon wrote 1,000 songs. I mean, I don't know if those were all religious, but that's a lot of songs. And you find this, as well, like even in Proverbs, you find that after chapter 25, there's a note that says that the men of Hezekiah added more Proverbs of Solomon. So like there must have been other books of Proverbs by Solomon that got added in as well. So I assume this is an editing down of a larger body of music. And some of it is from David. Even the stuff from David, I think, may have been adapted from even earlier stuff. Like David may have, people didn't like assume originality the way people do today. They took more of an if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach to literature. And so I assume that David adapted a lot of what existed at his time. And then, so some of these are very easily datable individually, like Psalm 88, 89 mention the destruction of the temple and the removal of the king. So those are easy to date after the fall of the temple. Many of these Psalms are not really datable, and they don't, the ones that don't have the Davidic superscription, especially. And so who knows when they were written, and they may have circulated independently before being included. Yeah. And then, you have some, I forget which, but there are some like, that is it Psalm 53 and 30. I remember, forget which ones, but there are some which are like almost identical to each other. Like there's one that's kind of in there twice. as well. It's just different versions of the same song. But yeah, this roughly dates to when people, I would argue, are arranging the books. And so but the point is that we get new songs that get added at different points in redemptive history. And just kind of to follow up on that observation, we find the phrase "a new song" various times in the Psalter. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done wonders. His right hand and holy arm have saved for him. The logic here seems to be that God has done some fresh act of salvation, and so it's appropriate to sing him a new song. Of course, it's appropriate to keep singing the old songs so they wouldn't be preserved, to remember God's deliverance at the Red Sea. But when God does something new, we don't just go back and sing the song of Moses from the Red Sea. We sing a new song that recognizes what God has done. And the same thing comes up again, just to jump ahead to Revelation. And I heard a sound from heaven like the sound of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. And the sound which I heard was like harpists playing on their harps, sorry, typo. And they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and elders. And nobody was able to learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Okay, so not to dive too deeply into the symbolism of Revelation, but I'd argue that 144,000 is a big round number for all Christians. But notice the theme that this new song, which very much is, we'll see next week when we get into the New Testament passages, is very much a response to Jesus and his work, the Lamb that has been slain. And nobody's actually able to learn the song except for those who have been redeemed. Like, you have to actually experience the redemption of God. Like, not just the lamb doesn't just have to be slain, but it has to be applied to your heart and your life before you're able to learn this heavenly song. So I think this is the same theme. God's redemptive acts enable us to sing a new song. And I think this is the final thing I'll mention today, and we can do some discussion. But the special role of women in singing. Of course, we saw that Chronicles passage, the whole assembly sang. Singing is one of those things that involves the participation of the whole people that the chronicler always wants to highlight. So, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the stuff in the temple is only done by the priests, and other stuff is only done by the Levites. But there are certain things that everybody is participating with. And even so, you might be the one bringing a sacrifice, for instance, in which case you put your hands on the animal. There are certain participate. Maybe you even give a testimony of what God's done for you. So that's one way in which you might participate. But whatever's happening in the temple, everybody participates in the song. And one thing to particularly highlight here is that there are special roles even for women here. Who don't have many special roles in the Old Testament. So I think it's worth highlighting. So Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took the tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out behind her with tambourines and with dancing. So in a great victory, it's actually especially the women who lead the celebration in song. And in my Isaiah 40 sermon, I drew a parallel of this too, that the person bringing like gospel news of Israel's deliverance is female. Why is that? It's because there's this, this great God is this king who's coming back victorious, and it's traditional for the women to be heralding that. We also find a mention to official female singers a couple times. So in Chronicles, Jeremiah composed a lament for Josiah, and all the male singers and female singers have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. And they handed them down as a statute over Israel, and they are written in the book of Laments, which, by the way, we don't seem to have. This doesn't seem to be Lamentations. The Laments and Lamentations don't seem to be about Josiah. So this would be more music that we're told about, but we don't, that existed, but that we don't have and hasn't survived. But I actually bring the verse up to point out male singers and female singers, which are listed as two distinct groups. I don't know what kind of different roles or diversification there was. One assumes there was some kind of difference because, of course, you can just group male and female together in a single male plural noun in Hebrew. And it distinctly always lists them separately, which is interesting. but female singers clearly have a special job, a special role in the singing. And then, of course, in Ezra and Nehemiah, in the lists of people who return from exile, they pay a special attention to people whose work is going to be needed for the temple. They tell you about the Levites and the priests who are brought back. And both of the lists of returnees in both books mention a number of male singers and female singers who return. It almost makes you wonder if the female singers' role is hereditary as well, like the male singers' role seems to be, involving, the children of Asaph, Jeduthun, and Heman. But however that may be, I just bring it up to point out the importance of specifically designated female singers who have a special role in the temple worship. And I think, let me open it up for questions at this point about what we've covered.
So that's the introduction of harmony, male and female singers?
Almost certainly not. Just based on music history, I assume is probably unison. I'm not an expert on this, but 4-part harmony is relatively recent in the human history, and I don't know. There could have been forms of polyphonic music, perhaps. Obviously, they would be singing in different registers. So one thing I'd love to do more would be study ancient Near Eastern music, so we can make some plausible conjectures about this. But it's just kind of really hard to tell whether, what form of music. But my sense is that unison singing is a lot more likely, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, it's kind of interesting because all the other worship roles in the temple could be done by a man, and a woman couldn't do it any differently. But in singing, a woman brings a different voice. And as we think about the whole image of God, human beings being made in image of male and female, it's missing, the song is missing something without the female voice. It might be an interesting thing to pursue.
Yeah, and one thing I should mention, though, even if we're like singing in unison, like call and response was probably a theme. So there may have been lines which belong to the male singers or to the female singers. That would be a very common pattern to find musically at this point. And of course, we have all kinds of, like, if you think, one thing to think about when you're reading a psalm is how many different voices are there? Are there lines in the psalm that are talking to other lines? Because that seems to be a big feature of a lot of psalms. Other thoughts? Any thoughts about lament in worship? Is that something you guys have thought about before?
That lament that is composed by David for Saul and Jonathan is pretty remarkable. And I think that it has a call to the people even of the New Covenant, that when you have a funeral, there's an opportunity for grief to be brought before God. That it's something that I think much of our evangelical culture has almost denied.
Any other
I
thoughts?
went to a funeral of a fairly young man, and that the pastor said, "Oh, this is a service of celebration," and he didn't give the widow and the children the opportunity to grieve in the context of the people of God.
Mm.
Hi, Jamie. This is I mean, it's not something I haven't thought about quite a bit and sometimes talk to people about. We've had Japanese people say, I really have a hard time in worship, in the more contemporary kinds of worship that's all praise and happy. And they said, they'll come and say, I'm not happy, and I don't find the worship is possible for me because it doesn't allow for my sense of grief and heartache. And there are a lot of things to lament about in this world, as well as things to be joyful about. And it's an argument in favor of psalm singing because the Psalms do give the full scope to our emotional range. And if we cycle through them, then we'll address them, not every week, but from time to time.
Yeah. And I think one comment on the genre of lament as well is that one of the things laments do so well is they with one exception, which is Psalm 88. Every psalm of lament in the Bible has some kind of turn towards an expression of hope or confidence at the end. So one of the things they do so well is they meet us where we're at in this and give us permission to even speak to God about dark emotions, which I think is hard. I think some people think they shouldn't be, that they should be coming before God with joy, which means always just being very, upbeat and happy. But, when you see how the psalmist talks to God and it's just very real about feeling abandoned, feeling crushed, and it can really help us express where we are with God. And then they turn us towards hope and confidence in God and bring us back there. It's just a wonderful service that they can do for us.
Jamie, are you going to make any comment on the supposed hymnic elements in the Pauline documents, the Christological hymns?
I've got my slides done through next week, so maybe I can take a little bit of time this week looking at it. I think, maybe I'll go read about it and get back to you and see. I think right now, I just don't know how you prove that. It seems like something, scholars enjoy suggesting. Certainly there are poetic elements. That great passage in Philippians where, he talks in Philippians 2, where he talks about the Son not considering equality with God something to be grasped, but emptying himself. And he starts being equal with God, and it ends with the being equal being he did not consider to be grasped. If you actually pull that out in Greek, it's huparkon uk harpagmon. And if you were to remove the vowels and just look at the consonants, you would see that the consonants formed a perfect chiasm. So there's definitely some, and that's pretty impressive, that alliteration there. So there's some pretty impressive poetic stuff in Paul, and some people think it's hymns. I'll spend a little bit of time seeing if I can figure out how solid that is or not, and I'll mention it next week. Any thoughts about the reasons why we sing? Rather than just say, reciting, like we do the confession of sin or confession of faith normally.
You covered that.
Yeah, I was wondering if
Unity.
you guys had any thought about it. Did I miss anything?
Well,
Do you
I
agree?
mean, there's a sense in which the unified singing of praise it enables me to get involved in a way in praising God on the worship service on Sunday morning that is harder for me to do in my easy chair during my quiet time.
Because it's corporate and it involves us all being involved in it together.
And I'm encouraged not only by my neighbors singing, but by the careful format, both liturgy and melody. I'm encouraged by my posture. I'm not slouched in my chair. My whole being's involved. That's stuff you covered.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions or thoughts for today?
It's an enormous gift. It tells us something about the beauty of our God.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we'll call a halt and we'll come back and go through some of the New Testament passages and then look at some specific issues that that are more practical application next week. But let me go ahead and close this in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this gift of singing. We thank you that you've created us in such a way that we can express praise and joy in a way that's unified with our brothers and sisters, in a way that glorifies and pleases you. Even though we are imperfect, you are pleased to hear us praise you when it's genuine. So we pray that you would be with us as we come to worship you this morning. Help us to be aware of the beauty of Christ, just overwhelmed with it. Help us to flee from our sin. Help us to repent and confess it and receive the love and forgiveness that's offered in Jesus. Help us to praise you by the power of your Spirit this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I'll see you guys in the service.